dedicated to preserving this amazing, remarkable community's legacy, to making sure that we all remember. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. Everyone in this room will remember. But it's our job as Jewish women, because God knows we can talk, is to go out of this room and to talk about what we hear tonight and to talk about all the stories you've heard all your lives. It's part of your DNA. I know it's as ingrained in you as it is being proud of your grandchild or boasting about your son who got into dental school or your cousin who married Mr. Right. It's ingrained in you. And you're going to leave this room tonight and you're going to be sure that tomorrow you tell somebody what you heard tonight. And you're going to tell them the stories that you've heard all your life, the stories that you've lived with. And even though most of you in this room, and some of you might have been, because I am beyond humbled to be speaking to a room not just of daughters of survivors, but to have so many survivors in this room tonight. I cannot tell you how humbling that is. If I don't get off the Clemson pride throughout the program, it will truly be a miracle of miracles. But it is, talking about this book is something I have been doing non-stop for 12 years. My children laugh and they say that I actually follow women into restrooms in public spaces and say, can I just tell you a story from Recipes Remembered? Because it has my heart and soul. And again, I know it has yours. And I know that whatever story I tell you tonight, you've heard. You've heard it with a different survivor. You've heard it in a different camp. You've heard it in a different woods, a different death march, a different experience. But we all have in common this need to share these stories. And that's what Recipes Remembered does. I will start out by saying that my husband, that incredibly handsome and patient man over there who is now videoing, because I'm going to try to press this. No, my granddaughter stayed up past her bedtime to watch in New York, but it's not happening. But we crossed the border, and I am now adding to my personal resume, book smuggler. Who would have thought that at 67, almost 68 years old, I could add something new to my resume, but it's book smuggler. Because we got to the Canadian border with a trunk load of books, which I am going to compel you to purchase, because not only are the proceeds from tonight going to the new and amazing Toronto Museum, but all my proceeds, anything that's on these fingers and these red-soled shoes, all goes to charity. We have sold 20,000 plus copies of this book. 20,000 plus. And it has all benefited a Museum of Jewish Heritage, our Holocaust Museum in New York, other organizations, and to help us reprint the books. We are now going on our 8th printing so that we are never out of circulation. So that is why I say, buy a book. And if there are no more books, and I'll say Alavai again, if there are no more books, I will make a way, I will smuggle them across the border again. I will come back to Toronto. I didn't even get to eat any hot dog on the street or shoe shop or do any of the other things that I feel you're famous for. And we will bring you more books. So we will get started, and I'm just going to ask if I can have just a cup of water that's over on the table. So I'll start with the obvious. First of all, I started by saying I never use a microphone, and that's because my son-in-law says that I have the loudest voice on the planet. So even amplified, I think you can probably tell that if I didn't have a microphone in front of me, you would probably still be able to hear me. But just so that I don't really blow out the ears of the people in the front, all just for the sake of those in the back, I will use the microphone. I started this project back in about 2009, and it was an outgrowth of something that my very wise and supposedly watching sister once said to me, and that was on the heels of our having sold our family lighting business. Now, many of you might actually have something Murray Feist hanging in your home. You might have bought it at Union Electric or Royal Lighting or Living Lighting. Those were all, unless God is calling you, turn your phone off. Thank you. Now, for all I know, I'm in a room of survivors. God could be calling somebody in this room. I don't doubt it, but unless you're expecting a call from him or her, let's turn it off. So we sold that business, and my sister said to me, we did well. Now let's do good. And I was trying to figure out what my good was going to be. And because I don't think I'm as good a person as my sister, who decided to volunteer for the Israel Cancer Research Fund, which has an amazing office and center here in Toronto. You're actually our most well-represented branch of the ICRF. But I decided my good would have to be something I could really have fun doing. And for me, that was something to do with cooking, because I love to cook, I love to eat. That man over there loves to eat as well. And so I knew I was going to cook. And I also had tremendous respect for the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is our Holocaust museum at Battery Park, whose position for those, can I just see with a show of hands, has anyone been? Okay, it's an amazing museum, and I'm going to say it's in a very hard to get to place, all the way back there. Good for you. It's about as far from where most people in New York are as you are in the back of the room. It is not an easy place to get to, but it has a view of both the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island, and it perfectly encapsulates what they stand for. They have an eye to the past, but they also illuminate the future. And I wanted to do something to benefit that museum. So I went to them one day, and I said, I've got a great idea. I'm going to write a cookbook, and I'm going to donate all the proceeds to you, and you don't have to do anything. And much to my surprise, they said, that sounds like a great idea. Write the book. And I went home, and I was now panicked, because I now said, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to write this book. I'm going to have to really do this. This is not, I really have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So I studied how to write a cookbook. I went to the New School down in New York, and I learned the ins and outs of writing a cookbook. And I made my first call. And I am lucky that my first call was to Regina Feiner-Schmidt, because Regina was awesome, as I'm sure you lovely ladies would be if I had spoken to you about your experiences and about how you cook as well. And she said to me, Mamala. Now I'm starting out by saying, I am the worst at accents. I tried in my entire car ride up here with my husband to say a boat, and I could not say a boat. It kept sounding like a boat. It kept sounding like I'm aboard. It did not sound like about. Could all of you just in unison say about for me? Yeah, there you go. It's just, I don't know, it's obviously something inherent in you. I can't do it. But even worse than my Canadian accent is my Eastern European accent, but it is not going to prevent me from using it tonight. So in my best Eastern European accent, Regina said to me, oh, Mamala, I hear you live on Park Avenue in New York City. And I said, I do. And she says, well, then maybe instead of you coming to me, I'm going to come to you. So, one wonderful day, Regina Feiner came to my apartment. I don't know if she was entirely impressed and felt she slept for no reason, but she came to my apartment and we talked about her experience during the war. And she told me her story, stories that you all know, stories that you've heard all your life. First time I had heard it. And she told me the story, and we took a deep breath, and we got through it. And I heard about the people she lost, and I heard about the people she found. I heard how she went to a DP camp, which I have to be honest, is the J date of the war. Because you did not need, there were no apps, there was no match, there was no photo, no Googling anyone. You went into a DP camp alone, depressed and isolated. You came out married and pregnant. That's just the way it goes. Just the way it went. So she told me about her experience in the DP camp. And after I said to her, well, we got through with the hard stuff. Now it's going to be easy. We're going to talk about food. Tell me about your signature recipe. And she said, what's a signature recipe? And I said, Regina, it's something you make all the time. And she says, oh, put this down so I can use my hands. So she said, oh, my signature recipe? I make kluski. Hey, kluski, you know kluski. I didn't know kluskis. I said, how do you make them? She says, well, sweetheart, it's so easy. You take a little bit of flour, mix some potatoes, you have kluski. And I, of course, looked at her and I said, well, Regina, maybe you have kluski if you do that. I know I'm not going to have kluski if I do that. So her daughter Evelyn was there and she said, I speak Regina. Let me help. So she says, Mom, when you go to the supermarket to buy the ingredients to make kluski, what's the first thing you buy? She says, well, that's simple. I buy potatoes. She says, good. She said, when you buy potatoes, do you buy 5 pounds, 10 pounds? How big a bag do you buy? She says, I buy a bag. She says, can you carry the bag? She says, there's nobody else to carry it for me. She says, Mom, when you make the kluskis, she says, how many potatoes are left in the bag? I had known Regina now for maybe 45 minutes. I was positive that I knew her answer. She says, I wouldn't leave a potato if my life depended on it. I was starving during the war. I know better than to leave a potato. And with that, Evelyn looked at me and she said, she carried the bag, she used them all, 5 pounds of potatoes. Every recipe unfolded in the exact same way. I was told to add a bissel of this and a handful of that. Now, I had never written a cookbook before, but I've read cookbooks, and I know that generally Julia Child did not advise you to use a bissel of this and a handful of that. So I had to hone in on how you actually made and prepared these dishes. Again, with a show of hands, I was told so many times to use a glass. Right. We all know it was a Yortzeit glass, but back in the day, a Yortzeit glass was generous. Now, a Yortzeit glass is this big. I was told to make a cake by Dr. Ruth Westheimer, who, even though she's American, I'm sure you've heard of her. She did not advise me on anything sexual, much to his dismay, but she did advise me to use an eggshell of matzo meal. Hello? A jumbo eggshell? A regular eggshell? So for 1 year, in case you want to know if you can make the recipes that are in this book, for 1 year, I tested and tried every recipe I was given over and over and over again until they could be perfectly replicated. And at the end of that year, that sainted man turned to me and he said, you know, for 1 year, we've been eating like 80-year-old Polish peasants. And I'm going to say to you, what's so wrong about that? The food was organic before anyone knew what organic food was. Ellen's daughter, the vintner, will tell you that the wines were all pure and natural. They had no additives and no other ingredients. If it could grow in the ground and it could last in the cellar, that's what they ate. It was all white. I'm going to say it was beige food for the most part. It was potatoes and farmer's cheese and cabbage and lokshen, and it was very beige, but it was good food. I laughed when one of my daughters took me to this really trendy restaurant in the West Village of New York, and we sat down for dinner, and as a side dish, this very fancy on-trend chef was offering toasted buckwheat groats with caramelized onions, farfalle pasta for like $15. I don't know what that is Canadian, but it definitely should not be $15. It's kosher varnishes, we know that. And the point is that these foods have been nurturing and nourishing our people for generations. They're good and they're delicious, but they're not all that you're going to find in the book. Because, as you all know, we've been thrown out of every country on the planet, and we've landed pretty much everywhere. And so some of the recipes represent foods from the Dominican Republic. And arroz con pollo is the recipe that I got from this wonderful survivor from Sosua. And someone from Shanghai gave me a Chinese recipe, and I have a recipe from Milan of semolina gnocchi, because that's where she was waiting while she made Aliyah to Israel. So the recipes in the book are very eclectic, and they represent the one thing that I learned. They represent the best version of that food anybody has ever eaten. And I know that because every person who gave me the recipe told me it's the best version that anyone has ever eaten of that dish. So I got a recipe for the best matzo balls. Now, for instance, for me, the best matzo balls were my mother's. They were sinkers, not floaters. They were sinkers. If you put them in the bowl too aggressively, they cracked your china. Yes. I don't lie. I don't make anything up. We would eat them on the first night of Passover, and we would know that Passover was over when we passed the first matzo ball. It happened to be 8 days, so it worked out very well, and now we were done. We were done with my mother's matzo balls. But the matzo balls that I got for this book, they're the best, because every one of you makes the best version of that dish for your family. And so this recipe, I can guarantee you, has the best version of anything you have ever eaten, just so you know. Now, there was one time where I was at this really lovely woman's home in the city. She lived on Sutton Place, which is fancier than Park Avenue. And she gave me a recipe, and she raved about it. And she kept elbowing her husband, Julius. Isn't it the best? Julius, it's the best. Isn't it the best? And finally, and I think he had to go to the ER when we were done, but finally he said, yes, it's the best. It is the best. When I was ready to leave, Julius walked me to the elevator. And he said, I need to tell you 3 things. The first, don't make that recipe. He says, it's terrible. She's a good cook, but that's not one of her best recipes. Don't make it. I said, okay. He says, get another one. I said, fine. I said, what's the second thing? He says, I need to tell you a dirty joke. I don't remember it. I wish I did. But I will never forget the look on his face when he saw the look on my face that he wanted to tell me a dirty joke. And I said, Julius, what's the third thing? He says, she doesn't know it, but I'm 6 years older than she thinks I am. The fact of the matter is, I laughed more than I cried. Because, and again, I'm telling you something you already know. There is something magical about someone who survives what some of the people in this room survived, what your families survived, the stories you've heard. There is something in them. I know that so many of my survivors, and they are my survivors at this point, so many of my survivors said it was luck. And I looked at them sometimes and I said, not that luck did not come into play. Because of course it did. I said, but there was also something about you maybe. Maybe an inner strength. Maybe the ability to be intuitive at a time where somebody else wasn't. Maybe a feeling that you had. Maybe the way that you ingratiated yourself to an awful person at the right moment in time. There was something about you. There is something about this remarkable community of Holocaust survivors that has imprinted on me. I don't have a single family member who was a survivor, but this community has imprinted on me to such a point that I don't stop talking about them for 12 years, and God willing, I will continue to do for as long as anybody wants to listen. So you look at this book and you say to yourself, it's lovely. This lovely woman, she drove all the way from New York. I'm surprised you even let us in. We're like that noisy downstairs neighbor that the upstairs neighbor keeps wanting to stomp on the floor and say, stop, knock it off. That's what I think New York is to Canada. But you let us in nonetheless. And I came here not to talk about a cookbook. I'm not talking about a cookbook. Because some of you don't cook anymore. Some of you have a grandchild who has become a vegetarian vegan who only eats on odd days of the week. I'm sure some of you have turned your kitchen maybe into a Zumba room. Maybe you do Zumba in that room. It's possible. I don't care if you don't cook anymore. You read. All of you are literate. I've heard that Canadians are literate, and that you do read, and so you're going to read this book. And while many of you could probably write this book, you didn't. I did. So you're going to read it, and you're going to read these stories, and you're going to talk about them, and you're going to share them. And we're going to take these stories and add them to the stories that you already know and cherish. So I'll start with a story about Mary. Not a very Jewish-sounding name, but Mary. Mary Mayer. And I went to Mary's home on a very, very snowy day. And I got to her door and she said, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I don't have a story to tell. And I looked at Mary, because I had already spoken to about 75 survivors who also didn't have a story to tell. And 3 hours later, their story was told. And I said, Mary, I bet you have a story to tell. And she did. And she was a Hungarian survivor. And those of you who are familiar certainly know that Hungary, the war came late to Hungary. And I think many of the Hungarian citizens, Jewish citizens, thought that they had probably lucked out here. And so some who had been in boarding schools and other places began to trickle home because they felt they were now safe. And it's now 1944, and Mary's family was one of those families. She lived a very privileged life, and she went to boarding school in Switzerland. But her family brought her home. And the war came to her town, and the Nazis took her mother and her father, and her governess got false papers for Mary to say that she was a Christian child. And she risked her life by doing that, but she loved Mary and wanted to protect her. And Mary got on a train with those papers, and she went from the Buda side of Budapest to the Pest side. And she saw a flyer at the train station. Someone was looking for a farmhand. Now this was a child who had a governess and people who cooked and cleaned and did everything for her. And she was now applying for a job on a farm as a farmhand. And she got the job, and she worked there throughout the year of 1944 into 1945. And one day Mary was up in the attic, and she saw a tank coming down the street. And she said, "That's it, we're finished." And so she walked downstairs, and she went out on the street, and she greeted the driver of the tank. And she said to him in German, remember she's Hungarian, she says to him in German, "Welcome to our town. We're so happy to have you here." And he answers her in Russian. And he says, "I am here to liberate your town." And she answered him in Russian. And she said, "I am a Jewish girl, take me home." And he hoisted her up on the tank. And they drove to the edge of the bridge, where the bridge to connect the two sides together. But it had been destroyed during the war. And I said to her, "Mary, oh my goodness, how did you get home?" And she says, "Oh, sweetheart, it wasn't a big deal. I waited for a wintry cold day, and I walked across the Danube." My husband and I got on one of your fakakta highways today, and we drove for 7.5 hours to go 3.5 miles. Is your entire country under construction? Back to Mary. We were complaining so bitterly in the car about the traffic. Mary walked across the frozen Danube and thought it was no big deal. What I've learned from Holocaust survivors is perspective. And unfortunately, perspective is so fleeting. It seems so real in the moment, and then it's gone. But I bet that's not the case for all of you in this room. I'd like to think you hold on to your perspective a little bit longer. And each time I talk about this book, it imbues me with a little bit more of that tenacity to hold on to mine. She walked across the frozen Danube. Just let that marinate. Celia Kenner, she was 7. Great cook. Make anything that says Celia Kenner in the book. Great cook. And Celia Kenner, or Gigi as her grandchildren call her, she was in Poland, as I'm presuming many of you were, and the majority of the survivors that I interviewed in the book were from Poland. And you'll see that the book is divided by country because each of the foods are representative of the country that we spoke to them from, and their stories all seem to be similar. Hungarian stories were similar. The Sephardic Jewish stories from Greece were similar, and such was the same for the Polish. So Celia was in Poland, and she was playing on a playground with a group of children that had been her friends the day before. So she had no reason to think they were not her friends on that particular day, until a truck drove by with a megaphone saying, "We're collecting Jewish children." And her friends all said, "There's one!" And they grabbed her, and they put her on the bus. And Celia, 7 years old, I actually think she was like 6.5, turning 7, said to the bus driver, "Why did you do that? Why did you pick me up? What did I do to you? Do you have children? Would you want somebody to do that to your child? Let me off this bus now." And he opened the door and he pushed her off the bus, which was very lucky for her because the bus was not going anywhere good. And instead she ended up in the ghetto. And I don't know if it was the Lodz ghetto, which I know was founded by members of this congregation, but she was in the ghetto in her town. And her mother was a beautiful woman. And while she didn't give me details, she certainly implied that it helped her mother work on the outside. But her mother would come into the ghetto on a very regular basis, and she would check on Celia. And Celia was there with a couple of aunts and uncles and some cousins. And one day her mother came in and she said, "They're going to liquidate the ghetto. You have to hide." And they spread the word throughout. and they all found hiding places. But Celia couldn't fit where her aunt and uncle were, so she found her own spot. And again, lucky for her, she did. Because she said she heard on the street that night her aunt's voice calling out, "Celia, wherever you are hidden, stay, my dear, and be sure to tell our story." And Celia the next day was still hidden, and her mother came into the ghetto, and she searched for her, and she found her, and under a cloak, she wore a large coat, she smuggled her out of the ghetto, and she took her to a farm in the woods where a Christian family said they would take care of her. And they did. For 2 years, they took care of her. She never left her room, she never went near a window, she never sat at their table, but she was safe until the family next door was discovered for having hidden a Jewish child. And the mother in this home said, "I cannot risk the lives and the safety of my children. I can't hide you here any longer. I'm going to take you to a barn. I bring food there every 3 days for the animals. Do the best you can." She says, "But before you go, I need to tell you, there seems to be someone sleeping upstairs in the barn. I only caught a glimpse of her. She seems very ill, and I don't think she'll survive much longer. So I wish you only good luck." And Celia went into the barn, and she climbed up the steps to the rafters where she heard this woman moaning. And she walked over to her, and she discovered it was her mother. Not even the woman who took Celia in realized that. And every 3 days, Celia climbed down from that rafter, and she got the food meant for the animals, and she fed herself and her mother. And together, those two women walked out of that barn. Celia was now about 8.5, and her mother was very frail, but they survived. And they hooked up with the father. Years later, he found them, and he walked down this road, this boulevard, because he heard from somebody that they were living in New York on a street that was very wide. And so he went to New York, and he found them. The Grand Concourse happens to be this really wide expanse, and he knocked on every door. According to Celia, it took months and months, and he found them, and they reunited. And what was so, not that the whole story is not so meaningful, but one of the other incredible moments of it is Celia said the day that she was taken, she was wearing her costume for a dance recital. And it's the picture that's in the book. And when she met with her father years later, he had that picture in his pocket because he had taken it of her about a week prior to the incident. And it's just one of those incredible stories. And so my survivors imbue me with perspective, and they imbue me with hope. Because if Celia could nurse her mother back to health and could meet up with her father again, well, then there is hope in this world that things do happen. Good things can happen. For me, I feel most things that happen are beshert. I think they're meant to be. To the bottom of my toes, I was meant to write this book. It has changed my life. I was meant to write this book. I was meant to share this book with as many people as humanly possible. I was on QVC sharing this book with America, where we sold 6,000 books in 6 minutes to presumably not completely, entirely Jewish audience. This was my calling, other than my children and my grandchildren. But beshert, to me, is the driving force. And so I'll end with a story of beshert about 2 women. And I'm going to step away because I wear a dress to every single book talk because of this story. Ada Ehrlich and Nadia Bergson were two women from a small town in Poland who were in Auschwitz together. They were two women who were part of the only uprising ever to take place in that camp. They are the women who would take the hems of their skirts and they would fill it with gunpowder when they worked in the munitions factory. And every night they would come home from the factory and with their fingers they would undo a stitch and they would pour gunpowder that they collected into a receptacle because they were hoping to create a bomb. And the organizer, the motivator of this plan, was a woman who was hanged in the center of the Auschwitz square because she would not reveal the names of her co-conspirators. And Ada and Nadia's part of their plan was to get this vessel to the Sonderkommandos who were working at the crematorium so they could blow it up. And they got it there, and once ever it happened, they blew up a crematorium. And many historians credit this act of defiance with the undoing of the Nazi regime, because they began to realize that not only did you have partisans fighting in the woods, and you had other countries finally coming to the aid, but you now had those in the camps beginning to really fight back. And these two women walked out of Auschwitz and they never saw each other again. Of course they saw each other again. What kind of story would that be for me to leave you with? I would be the worst person from America ever. So they saw each other again. They bumped into each other in New York City. My sister and I lived 3 blocks away from each other in New York City. We bump into each other maybe once every 5 years on the street. It is really a beshert when you bump into somebody that you were in Auschwitz with on a street in New York City. And they became friends again. And they began attending each other's life cycle events and sharing moments and going to brisses and bar and bat mitzvahs and living a life as family, because you all know that when you lose your family in the war, you make family of friends. And they became each other's family. And as would happen in modern times, one of them moved away to California. And she had a granddaughter. Her name is Jolie. And Jolie wanted to go to college on the East Coast. So she went to Cornell in Ithaca. And her roommate was dating somebody. And you're smiling. Did you read this in the book? And her roommate was dating a boy from Ithaca College, not too far across the border from you guys. They introduced each other to another person. And Jolie began dating this very lovely friend of her roommate's boyfriend, Jason. And she brought Jason home to California for one of the holidays. And they began talking about their families. And as you can tell where this woman's face is saying, Jolie was the granddaughter of Ada, and Jason was the grandson of Nadia. And both women lived to know they were dating. One woman lived to know they were married. Neither was alive when Jason and Jolie gave birth to twins. One named for Ada and one named for Nadia. That's beshert. That's beshert. I was meant to write this book. You were meant to be in this room to hear about it. This is why we're here. I'm here personally because I saw Niagara Falls today. It doesn't compare to the force of nature that are Ellen and Esther. They could power the entire grid and probably complete the construction of your roadways in much faster time. So I thank you ladies for bringing me to this beautiful place. I'm going to take a picture of you amazing women so that we have it for you in the back. You've got some spinach in your teeth? Yeah, you. Okay, good. Okay, all good. I want everyone to say, well, we could do better than that. How about we all say Beshert? Beshert. Thank you. Thank you for listening.